Good afternoon. Thank you everyone for joining us. We are going to be talking through about building a Microsoft 365 implementation roadmap today. Just before we get started, I just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping. So this webinar is being recorded and I'll be sharing the slides and also the recording after the event so that you can watch through on demand whenever you want or share with colleagues. Just to go through the rough agenda today, so we're going to be quickly talking about a brief overview of Microsoft 365 just to set the scene, and then we're going to go through a high-level Microsoft 365 roadmap, which we're going to split out into kind of the ideal phasing and implementation stages that we would recommend the way to approach it. We can also touch upon some optional add-ons that aren't included within Microsoft 365, and then we're going to wrap up just covering a little bit of ongoing management. We've also got Q&A, so there is a Q&A chat box as part of this webinar. Please pop your questions in. If it's relevant, we'll ask them throughout whilst we're in the flow of things, but if not, we'll have time at the end to go through questions. Just briefly to introduce us at Chorus, so we're Microsoft specialists based in the UK. We are an MSP and MSSP, and we cover all the different Microsoft solutions across Azure, Microsoft 365, Dynamics 365, and we've got the Microsoft accreditations to show for it. Now, I just want to give you a brief introduction to our speakers before I pass over to them. So we've got Joe Cato, our Principal Engineer for Cloud, and Jason Lee, our Collaboration and Information Management Lead. Joe's going to be covering more of the productivity and security elements of Microsoft 365, while Jason is more focused on the compliance and data protection and governance features. So I will pass over to Joe.
Oh, thanks, Lisa. So let's start off with what is Microsoft 365, just to make sure that everyone's on the same page. We're confident that everyone on the call is familiar with Office 365, which is the productivity platform from Microsoft, which provides workloads such as SharePoint, Exchange Online, and others. Microsoft 365 is a combination of Office 365, Windows 10/11 licensing, and also Microsoft's Enterprise Mobility and Security Suite, also known as EMS. EMS offers security and device management capabilities in the form of Entra ID Plan 1, Microsoft Intune, and a few others. Microsoft 365 is a great product offering from Microsoft and is a fantastic tool to allow you to achieve more securely and from anywhere, but it's just that, a product, and simply purchasing the product doesn't mean you're getting the most out of it. Some of the common conversations we have with customers is that they've been recommended to purchase Microsoft 365 and have done so, but don't really know what it offers. They don't understand what security and compliance features it can bring, in addition to the known productivity features. And once they do understand, it's then a question of where do I start? Finally, the cost of Microsoft 365 has recently increased due to the new commerce experience, or NCE, meaning there's an increased requirement to achieve value for money. So our approach to Microsoft 365 transition is split into 3 phases that you can see here. Customers transition from fundamental to optimal over time, and in doing so, increase the security, productivity, and compliance capabilities of the organization. It starts off with proof of concepts or POCs. POCs are great because they allow you to test, provide feedback on features on a small scale, and don't represent a significant cost to deliver. This all reduces risk and avoids a big bang approach. Phase 2 is then a mixture of organization-wide migrations of the items that were successfully demonstrated in the POCs and POCs of more advanced security or compliance features. Lastly, phase 3 is then a rollout of those advanced security and compliance features. So this slide at a high level outlines our suggested roadmap. Organizations typically start at the lower end of this roadmap, and over time, their technical maturity and adoption of Microsoft 365 increases. A lot of the more advanced features at the top of the roadmap rely on the more foundational aspects. A good example of this is a lot of the compliance items. It's quite difficult to implement Office 365 DLP, or data loss prevention, if the data is not located in a Microsoft 365 workload, such as SharePoint, Teams, or Exchange.
There's definite benefits in bringing all of your content, or as much as you can, under that Microsoft 365 umbrella so that you can manage it and protect it in a consistent way.
Yeah, definitely. And then here we've applied our 3 recommended phases to that roadmap, and we'll refer to this slide as we explain each phase. So this can serve as a general guide of what order each item should be implemented in. As I mentioned, fundamental is simply proof of concepts of migrating that data to the Microsoft 365 workload. You should also ensure that your workloads and identities are protected from day one with MFA and conditional access, and start thinking about a starter leaver process with governance wrapped around it.
Yeah, getting those lever processes nailed down is definitely something that you want to look at early when you start to get users managing content in OneDrive for Business, creating team sites, creating SharePoint sites. You've really got to have a plan for what happens if those users move on, change roles, and so on.
Cool. So as mentioned, the goal in this phase is to perform proof of concepts of those advanced features. So the proof of concept will provide you with the knowledge that A, the feature is suitable, and that you trust the migration or deployment process. And this is where most organizations currently are, to be honest. Identity is the security perimeter, and so it's crucial that as you start to migrate to Microsoft 365, that you secure those identities appropriately. Therefore, having that foundation level of security, which most organizations still don't have, is a vital step. And then you should then look at the POCs of these items. So we'll start off with a few examples of where certain organizations may find themselves currently. Starting with email, you may be using on-premises Exchange servers. You may also be using an Exchange system that's hosted by a third party, or possibly another provider entirely, such as Google Workspace. And the natural migration path here is to Exchange Online. User data, so just to clarify, that's data that's worked on by a single individual and either doesn't need to be shared with a wider team or is not yet ready to be shared with a wider team, is generally stored in the user's desktop or documents folders, which are then redirected to a file server or stored on their home drive that's only available in the office when on the VPN. And so the suggested migration path here is to OneDrive, as it gives you 1 terabyte of storage, built-in versioning control, and also access for any device. Then moving on to shared data. So this is data that's worked on by multiple individuals, or it could be a central repository of data for a given department or team. This is generally achieved using a file server and then connected to workstations using a network drive. So things like your G drive, your H drive, stuff like that. And so the natural migration path here is a SharePoint Online or Teams. In terms of the Office desktop applications, you may be using Office 2016, Office 2019, maybe 2022, or you may find that you've got a bit of inconsistency across the organization. Microsoft 365 provides you with those Office applications. They're constantly updated by Microsoft with new features, and so it's important that a POC of the rollout of these apps is included. And this is because when Microsoft develop new features within Microsoft 365, they assume that you're using the Microsoft 365 apps. You might have limited or no real-time collaboration capabilities, or you might be using something like Cisco WebEx, Zoom, maybe even Slack. Teams is a great collaboration experience. We're all speaking on the webinar right now, and is included in the most of your Microsoft 365 licenses. When it comes to identity protection, you might not have MFA on all systems, or it might only be in place for administrators' access to certain systems. And so I mentioned previously, identity security is key. It's important that you leverage conditional access to enforce MFA and also any other additional controls, and do that as soon as you can, really. In terms of your on-premises directory services, generally that's Active Directory. It's important to monitor that as well. And so with Microsoft 365, you can get Defender for Identity, and you install sensors on each domain controller. And what those sensors do is they essentially monitor what's going on, provide indicators of malicious behavior, and then raise that for investigation either by an internal or an outsourced cybersecurity operations center or CSOC. In terms of endpoint protection, you might not have much in place at the moment, or you may be using other vendors, maybe Sophos or McAfee. With Microsoft 365, you get Defender for Endpoint. It's highly recommended. It's lots and lots of features. We could probably do a webinar just on Defender for Endpoint, but essentially it integrates really nicely with Microsoft 365 Defender and also with Microsoft Sentinel to provide that holistic view for your incident responders. Lastly, as Jason alluded to earlier, it's important that you start to transition. You may have an IT-managed starter leaver process right now that focuses just on removing access. And so you need to start thinking about what your organization's data access and retention requirements are, particularly with leavers. Data is no longer retained indefinitely, so you need to think about how you update your processes to align with how Microsoft 365 works.
So if you had a complete blank slate here, you were starting right from scratch, what's job number 1?
It would be, if we say you're right near the bottom, for me, it would be Exchange, but also making sure you're using identity protection. So getting MFA in place, getting conditional access in place at the same time.
That sounds good. So a two-pronged attack: get identity and get email into Exchange Online. That sounds good to me.
The last thing you want is to sort of start making your way up that tree essentially, and find that later on down the line, as people are using Microsoft 365 quite extensively, that you then have to go through the pain of adapting user access to using MFA. Whereas if you get that in early, people are used to that immediately.
Definitely, sounds good to me.
Cool. So we'll now move on to the advanced phase, which comprises of organization-wide migrations of the items that we demonstrated with those POCs, followed by security and productivity items. And it also includes some of the compliance features, such as using Microsoft Information Protection to apply classification labels to those sites and teams. So we're starting to reduce our on-premises workloads by utilizing the equivalent cloud workload in Microsoft 365. Organization-wide migrations of those fundamental workloads are in progress, and we're beginning proof of concept of more advanced items, with some key callouts being, first of all, Intune. So Intune provides two key capabilities. You've got MDM and MAM, so mobile device management and mobile application management. Mobile device management focuses on those fully managed devices. So it's typically devices that are owned by the organization and are intended for work use only. With MDM, the device is fully controlled by IT and can be wiped remotely. Mobile application management focuses on personal mobile devices such as iOS or Android devices. These devices are typically owned by the user. The applications on the phone are controlled, but not the device. This means that IT can require certain controls, such as the latest version of iOS or Android, but IT can only wipe the data within the applications. Any personal data outside of the applications, such as text or photos, are not controlled by MAM and therefore cannot be wiped by MAM. Moving on, you've then got Windows Autopilot. So Autopilot is a great device provisioning experience. The process is that you purchase a device and send it to the user. The user unboxes it and signs in. The device then self-provisions and installs the required apps and configuration profiles. Apps such as Office, Edge, and any others are installed before the user gets to the desktop, and any policies such as BitLocker disk encryption are also applied. Compliance policies can also be assigned, which will mark the device as compliant or non-compliant. You can then leverage conditional access to deny access to Microsoft 365 if the device isn't compliant. And then also, should any technical problems be experienced with the device, or if it's lost, it can be remotely wiped using Intune.
I always think passwordless is an interesting one to touch on. Do you want to tell us a bit about passwordless?
Yeah, so you may have heard quite a lot recently about passkeys, and it's very close to coming out. It was originally going to be out in end of January, but Microsoft pushed it back a few months, so we're now looking end of March or so at this time. So I don't want to speak too much about that yet, just we don't know exactly its final form. So I'll focus on the current passwordless authentication methods. So that's Microsoft Authenticator and Windows Hello for Business. Microsoft Authenticator is the recommended method to perform MFA for push notifications and number matching, but you can also use it to provide passwordless. It's also known as phone sign-in within the app. When you enable this, the sign-in experience changes. So instead of typing your email address, password, and then receiving a push notification from Authenticator, you first type in your email address and then a number appears on the screen. You then get a push notification, and once you open up the app, you need to select the number that matches, complete any kind of authentication on your phone. So that could be Face ID, Touch ID, or even just a PIN, and then you're signed in. No need for a password. Windows Hello for Business, as the name implies, is only available on Windows devices. Windows Hello can use biometrics if the device has a supported biometric device, so again, fingerprint, facial, that sort of thing, or it can utilize a PIN. Windows Hello integrates with the device's Trusted Platform module, or TPM, to keep those secrets secure. Even if the device doesn't support biometrics, using a PIN is still considerably stronger. Once the user signs into their device using Windows Hello, they'll automatically be signed into any Microsoft 365 workload. So there's benefits from both sides, user and IT, for going passwordless. For the user, the obvious one is they no longer need to remember or change their password, no longer going to lose time by contacting IT to reset that forgotten password. And then for IT, the identities of users we've spoken about before as the new security perimeter are significantly stronger. And also IT spend less time resetting user passwords, which means that time can be focused on other more important areas.
That sounds really good. So we're also starting to see some of the Microsoft compliance tools come in at this stage. Really what this is about is starting to differentiate between how you manage different types of content. So for example, we've got site and team classification up there. So Microsoft Purview Information Protection, site and team classification. So this is about having your business users, when they create a SharePoint site or a team in Microsoft Teams, they choose a classification. So they choose a sensitivity classification. So ideally, you'll have these defined. It might be general, confidential, highly sensitive, whatever makes sense to you as an organization. And when they apply that classification, that label will apply commensurate protections. So if my user chooses a low sensitivity, we might allow them to add guest users to the team. We might allow them to access it from any device. If they label it as highly confidential or highly sensitive, we might be far more controlled. We might say, okay, no external sharing, must be accessed from a managed device, and so on, which ties back to Intune that Joe was talking about. Same idea for file and email protection. At the most basic level, you're having users classify files and emails. So as you save a Word doc, an Excel spreadsheet, or as you send an email, you're prompted to choose a classification, a sensitivity classification. And depending on what you choose, appropriate controls, restrictions will be put in place on that content. Information lifecycle management is another important one here. So most of us are now realizing we don't really want to be keeping everything forever. Apart from anything else, it gets hugely expensive. But from a compliance perspective as well, there are certain types of content you're obliged to retain, other types of content that you're obliged to delete really fairly quickly. So we can set up retention labels, retention policies that manage how long information sticks around for in a more granular way. We can tie that to our information architecture, and we can target that in various ways. Guest access reviews is probably another important one to call out here. So being able to invite external users into SharePoint, into Teams is a great capability, but you don't want that guest access sticking around indefinitely. So having a process whereby you're reviewing which external users are collaborating in your tenancy on a regular basis is a really useful governance capability.
Perfect. Cool. So we're now starting to move on to the optimal stage. And at this point, the advanced phase is generally complete and you're ahead of most organizations in terms of that technical maturity. So as you can see, this phase is very heavy on that compliance platform with other items that may or may not be suitable for all organizations. Some good examples of that are application proxy or Azure Virtual Desktop. As you start to near the top of this roadmap, your attention should start to turn from migration and deployment to the ongoing management and usage of that security and compliance data. So during this phase, those advanced security and productivity features are being demonstrated and rolled out. So some call-out examples are using device risk, which comes from Defender for Endpoint, to mark a device as non-compliant with Intune, which, as I mentioned previously, can then restrict your access with Microsoft 365. Defender for Endpoint is constantly assessing the device risk based on any vulnerabilities on the device, out-of-date software, things like that. You can also start to consider automating certain business processes using Power Apps and Power Automate. Generally, that's digitizing forms. You can also look to consider or test Azure Virtual Desktop or Windows 365 as a virtual desktop solution for seasonal or temporary workers. Azure Virtual Desktop and Windows 365 also work really well for any mergers and acquisitions if you need to get users on managed devices quicker than you can actually issue devices to them. And then also using Microsoft Sentinel with your in-house or outsourced CSOC to provide those detection and response capabilities.
So we can also see, I mean, that the Microsoft compliance capabilities are really heavily represented here. And that's because they quite often build on technical maturity in other areas. So you tend to do them later in a roadmap rather than earlier. So let's start with Office 365 DLP. So that's data loss prevention. It's a really powerful tool. This is about creating policies that detect when sensitive or confidential information is being shared inappropriately. Now, typically, that's when it's being accidentally shared with people outside your organization. That information might be financial, it might be privacy related, it might be personally identifiable, it might be health data, or it might be confidential data that's specific to your organization. So DLP is a fairly well-known product class, and it's usually targeted heavily at email. The big advantage of Office 365 DLP is doesn't matter whether we're sharing that sensitive data over email or whether we're sharing it in files directly from OneDrive or SharePoint, or collaborating on it in SharePoint and Teams. It's protected no matter which sharing mechanism you use. It can work in various ways. It can do a range of things when sensitive information is detected, from simply raising an alert to showing the user a hint saying, hey, it looks like you're doing something you might not want to here, right up to blocking that action altogether if that's appropriate. The reason why it's under optimal and not earlier on the roadmap is because you want to be careful in how you roll this out. You really need to have that mature understanding of what kind of data protection challenges you're facing. You need to understand what kind of content you're storing, what are the data risks, what are your regulatory obligations. And the other side of it is you can't really just turn on DLP. You have to roll it out slowly. You start in test-only mode. You want to make sure that you're not seeing large numbers of false positives, and you'll tune it over a long period, making sure that it's matching what you expect it to match before you turn it on and have it actually start blocking user actions. Endpoint DLP is about extending that protection to your managed devices. So Windows 11, Mac OS managed devices. This means that you can create policies that prevent users from, let's say, copying sensitive information to portable drives or saving files that contain sensitive content to other platforms and so on. But your devices do need to be cloud managed or hybrid managed before you do that. So again, it tends to be towards the later stages of a roadmap. Insider risk management is another one to call out. This builds on a whole range of other signals. It's all about combining signals from multiple sources to identify potential risks. So if you've onboarded devices for compliance, you can collect indicators for things like users copying files to USB, printing files, moving files to network shares. If you've got Defender for Endpoint deployed, you collect indicators for things like installing malicious software. If you've got data connectors pulling in information from your physical badging system or your HR system, you pull in signals from those platforms as well. And it's really about identifying risk when all of these things happen together. So all of these signals are happening all the time, but when you get clusters of, let's say, an employee's handed in their notice, they're accessing areas of the building they don't usually access, and they're downloading large numbers of files, together those things indicate that you might have a potential problem. And insider risk management is really about identifying those kind of risks. On the MIP side of things, or MPIP as it is now, this is about moving from manual classification to automated classification. So instead of relying on users to classify every file they touch, every email they send, we create policies or machine learning algorithms that trawl your sites, trawl your OneDrives, and label those files automatically. And it's in this final optimal phase because it really relies on you having a sound enough understanding of your content to train those algorithms and set up that automation.
Perfect. We've got a Copilot question in the chat, but we'll come to that in a few slides' time because I know we're touching a little bit on Copilot, so we can have a look at that then. But we'll quickly now touch on optional add-ons that you can bundle with Microsoft 365. None of these are must-haves in any sense, but you could look to replace any third-party solutions with a Microsoft solution here. It's worth bearing in mind that these are add-ons, and so they're not included with any Microsoft 365 license and have their own cost. The biggest one by far is Intune Suite. So Intune Suite is a bundle of the products you see on screen. I won't go through all of these in detail, but I will call out the most commonly talked about products. We'll start with remote help. So you might be using products such as TeamViewer, LogMeIn, or others to essentially provide desktop support to your users, whereby you sort of connect to their machine to provide support. Remote help is Microsoft's first-party solution. It allows you to view and control the screen in a similar way to those other products. It also allows you to run the application as a service. And what that means is that you can see and interact with user access control prompts, UAC prompts, where you can type in admin credentials if you need to. Then you've got Endpoint Privilege Management, or EPM. It's Microsoft's solution for allowing applications to run with administrative privileges, but not making the user an administrator of their device. So third-party options for this include things like Auto Elevate. It's worth bearing in mind, though, that EPM doesn't add the user to the local admins group. It's not something that Microsoft will be providing as part of this solution. It's focused purely on elevating those applications. But within EPM, you can configure whether an application is automatically elevated, if it requires justification, or if it requires IT to approve. You've then got Cloud PKI. So many organizations today are using things like Active Directory Certificate Services, also known as ADCS, to issue certificates to their users or devices. It's your public key infrastructure. This is used in several scenarios, but the most common scenario is to essentially secure the network using 802.1x. The idea is you can only connect to the network if you can present a certificate issued by your CA. The problem with this is that it requires you to maintain an offline root certificate authority, as well as an issuing intermediate certificate authority. These servers require licensing, maintaining, patching, backing up. Cloud PKI is where Microsoft hosts those CAs for you, and you can use Intune to then distribute the certificates to your devices or users. Then we've also got Enterprise App Management. This is the last one we'll focus on. You might be using other products like PatchIPC or Avanti to provide those patch management capabilities for applications like Adobe, Firefox, Chrome, and so on. Enterprise App Management is Microsoft's alternative. It's built into the Intune portal, and it leverages Intune's supersedence capabilities to replace application versions with new versions. Their app catalog is not the same size as competitors such as PatchMyPC, but it is growing quite quickly. And Jason, do you want to touch on syntax?
Yes, so syntax. Okay, so syntax, the naming's a little bit tricky here because Microsoft Syntax is in the process of being rebranded into SharePoint Premium, and both terms are currently actively in use. What it is it's a range of additional or premium capabilities. They're largely pay-as-you-go capabilities that enable you to solve some more specific challenges. So just to call out a few of these, we've got things like content assembly. So if you need to build repetitive documents by sort of putting templates and data together, we can do that. Document processing is all about extracting key information from file content using machine learning. So if you've got a whole bunch of invoices coming in and you're storing those invoices, invoices come in all different shapes and sizes. It's about training machine learning to pull out things like, okay, who's the payee, what's the amount, when's the due date, and so on. We've got things like image tagging. So we can tag images in a library automatically using descriptive keywords to make them searchable. We can translate documents or video transcripts automatically. And we can use OCR, so optical character recognition, to automatically scan images for printed or handwritten text and make that text searchable and usable. We've also got some add-on capabilities in the Microsoft Viva platform. So Viva is what's known as an employee experience platform. So it's a suite of apps, all integrated with Microsoft Teams and all focused on making life easier for your employees in various ways. So just to pick out a couple of examples, Viva Connections lets you build a dashboard that gives users quick access to useful resources. It also essentially lets you integrate your SharePoint intranet into Teams. Viva Engage builds on what used to be Yammer. That's all about enabling open communities, open conversations. If you've got things like working groups, study groups, social groups, and so on. Viva Amplify is all about enabling effective internal comms. You've also got things like goals for setting, communicating organizational objectives, learning for integrating training libraries into teams. Pulse, Glint and Insights are all about capturing employee feedback, gaining insight into trends, identifying burnout risks and that kind of thing. So there's a sort of range of capabilities there. Using all of them would probably be quite unusual. It's more likely that you're going to pick and choose and pick particular Viva platforms, particular syntax capabilities to tackle specific problems. So we've also got Copilot, which is obviously talked about an awful lot at the moment. So in the productivity area, there's really three core Copilot offerings. We've got Microsoft Copilot over on the left. This is basically giving you the same capabilities as ChatGPT, but with organizational data protection. So long as you're signed in, you've got data protection. Your data that you paste into Copilot isn't going to be used to train Microsoft AI and so on. Copilot Pro, despite the name, this is aimed at private individuals. So if you've got Microsoft 365 personal or family subscriptions, Copilot Pro lets you use Copilot capabilities in Outlook, Word, PowerPoint, Excel and so on to draft content, draft emails and so on. And then the big one is really Copilot for Microsoft 365. And this brings those generative AI capabilities into your Office apps, into Teams, into the workplace. So it can pull information from right across your Microsoft 365 tenancy to answer questions. It uses the Microsoft Graph. It can understand your emails, your chats, the documents you've saved, and so on. So this really opens up some significant opportunities. There was a question on this, which is about being forced to use DLP when you launch Copilot. I wouldn't say you're forced to use DLP. So Microsoft have put out some recommendations about optimizing your Microsoft 365 tenancy to get the most out of Copilot. And DLP is one of those recommendations. It's probably one that I would implement last. I think lifecycle management is probably far more important here, because if you're storing, let's say, 4 different versions of your HR policies, and users are using Copilot to ask questions about those HR policies, you're not going to get accurate responses. Okay, so classification also has a role to play here, because Copilot will respect those classifications, and DLP can provide a safety net as well in sort of locking down information that's in the wrong place. I wouldn't say it's essential to use Copilot, but it's certainly something that you might want to consider as part of a broader look at data governance alongside rolling out Copilot for 365.
Thanks, Jason. I've actually got another question here. Two actually, but I'll just touch on the Copilot one in Q&A. At what point along the roadmap should Copilot be introduced?
So there are some essentials that you really need to have in place before you roll out Copilot, but they're actually fairly basic. So you want to be using the subscription versions of the Microsoft 365 apps. You want your users to be using Outlook for desktop. You ideally want content in SharePoint and OneDrive. So if you're still storing most of your content in file shares, that content's obviously not going to be accessible to Copilot for 365. Beyond that, it's really about getting to a point where you're comfortable with the level of data risk. So once you're comfortable that your access management is appropriate. So Copilot, if I ask Copilot a question, it's not going to return answers from data that I don't have access to. But what it might do shine a light on where access management isn't as robust as it might be. Just the same as if you're if you're using search or if you're using delve, it's not going to blow a hole in your security, but it might shine a light on where your access management isn't as robust as it could be. Getting things like effective lifecycle management in place can really help improve the accuracy of what Copilot's giving you. It's basically giving Copilot accurate, up-to-date data to work with means you're going to get better responses out of it. But it's really, you can deploy Copilot at any point. There's no minimum seat count anymore. In January it was 300 user minimum. That's now gone. So if you want to pilot it with a small group of users, you can. It's really getting to a point where you're comfortable that your data governance is good enough. Copilot's not going to expose any data governance problems and start rolling it out at that point. It's probably also then a journey. It's, there's always room for improvement. So as you're using Copilot, you can continue to improve your data governance, get classification in place. Copilot will respect any controls put in place by sensitivity labels. So if you're labeling content as confidential and your confidential label says users must not extract content, then Copilot's going to respect that label, it's going to respect that constraint, and it's not going to pull content out of that label content or use that in any way. So I hope that helps to answer that question.
Cool. So throughout this webinar, we've referred to quite a well-defined migration path, but it is just a recommended approach. It's no way prescriptive. Most migrations are tailored to the organization. So some examples that you may be used to bring certain things forward might be license renewals for certain software. So an example that we commonly come across is endpoint protection software. Let's say an organization is currently using Sophos. Let's say their license renewal is due in 4 months' time. We'll look to bring that bit forward and sort of make sure that Defender for Endpoint is in place before Sophos expires. We have also assumed that Microsoft 365 E5 licensing is in place, but not all organizations have that license because it is the most expensive option. So the roadmap is also tailored to your organization and your license level. So once the implementation is complete, you'll be utilizing all of those aspects of your licensing and all of the benefits, but it now turns to ongoing management. You need individuals or teams to manage the security aspects, usually in the form of a CSOC, but also to keep on top of the ever-evolving nature of Microsoft 365 to see what new innovations are on the horizon and how they impact your organization. Your teams can achieve this using the Microsoft 365 Message Center, the Microsoft Tech Community Forums as well. Finally, Jason, there's an element to keep on top of the data protection and compliance aspects.
Yeah, there is, because the types of data you're storing are going to change, they're going to evolve. The regulations you work within are going to evolve. User behavior is going to change over time. DLP is really the classic example where you need that ongoing monitoring and tuning to make sure that it's still doing what you need it to do, to make sure that your false positives aren't creeping up. To making sure that you're catching everything that you want to catch. So some element of ongoing maintenance and monitoring is really important.
Perfect.
Amazing, thanks both. Just want to highlight a few next steps and resources to everyone. So I'll be sharing this information after the event, but we've just shared some links to some Microsoft documentation guides. There's also a really useful Microsoft 365 licensing map, and also a wealth of Microsoft 365 training and guides. So those will be included. We also offer a Microsoft 365 assessment. So if you'd like us to review your licensing or help build out a tailored roadmap, please do get in touch. And just want to then finish up just by asking everyone if there are any questions. I actually have a few here. I've got one for myself actually, just to pitch to you guys, which is what feature, in your opinion, is most commonly underutilized but has the most value?
Joe, do you want to go first?
Oh, I was hoping you would go first, like I would think.
I'll go first. I would say SharePoint. That's obviously it's close to my heart as it paid my mortgage for several years. But it's most people are paying for it already because it's part of every Microsoft 365 subscription. It gives you so many capabilities beyond what a file share can do for you in terms of how you manage content, how you make it securely accessible everywhere, how you automate processes around it, how you automate lifecycle management, and just really the whole package. It's something that's often underused, underappreciated.
Cool. Mine would be Intune, essentially. Device management is often overlooked. It's kind of like the last thing that anyone ever looks at is how the devices are provisioned, how they're managed. Similarly to you, Jason, it paid my mortgage as well, so it makes sense. But yeah, it's commonly underused. Devices are generally the last thing anyone thinks about, but you can use it quite extensively. Integrating a device compliance is really important for keeping your devices secure, especially with the types of attacks that are happening nowadays. So yeah, Intune would get my vote.
Brilliant. I've got one from earlier that was in the Q&A around Power Automate. What are some good examples of things to do with Power Automate?
Okay. So I think firstly, when we say Power Automate, we might also look at Azure Logic Apps because they do very similar things. It's any time where you need to share data between platforms. So a classic example would be we've got a purchase ledger mailbox. Loads of invoices pile into that mailbox every day. We want to extract those invoices, push them into SharePoint, where someone can pick them up, work through them in an orderly way. So Power Automate or Azure Logic Apps are really good ways of doing things like that. You can have it monitor the mailbox, automatically grab those invoices, automatically push them into SharePoint as you need them. Any kind of process automation around content, so publishing processes, approval processes, business authority workflows where you've got spending approval going through multiple stages depending on how much it is and which business area it is. All of those kind of processes are good candidates for Power Automate automation. It's probably also worth just mentioning as well, if you are still running any native SharePoint workflows, those will stop working as of 2026 in SharePoint Online. Power Automate is the basically the upgrade path for any of those native SharePoint workflows as well.
Amazing. Cheers, Jason. That's it that I can see for questions. Oh, I've also just got one pop in. Good timing. Gents, what do you think of the CSAT assessment? Is that also what you do? So I can actually answer that. Yes, we do CSAT assessments. Obviously, the security side ties in nicely with the whole Microsoft 365 roadmap. I think an answer tends to be tailored to what the organisation is looking for, whether it's the whole elements of Microsoft 365 or more of a focus perhaps on security or compliance or productivity, but the CSAT assessment is always a really good way to get started to work out kind of any gaps in security as well. Amazing. I think that's everything. Like I said, I'm going to be sharing resources after this, so keep an eye out for the email that'll be coming through. If you didn't get a question or didn't have a question at the time but want to ask one, please feel free to reply to the email and I can share it with Joe and Jason to get an answer back to you. So thank you very much. Thanks everyone for joining. And I think that's the end of it. Thanks all.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, everyone.